Test. Test. Ok, bon, ça marche. Je vais te bouffer une image de feu de camp. Donc, bon voilà, explanatory. Je vais juste lire mon livre, bien relax. Je me disais, tant qu'à faire, autant le streamer. J'espère que vous avez une bonne soirée. J'ai juste pas interagi avec le chat à ce soir. Je vais essayer de m'arranger pour avoir un chat un jour, mais pour l'instant, c'est ça qu'on a. Donc voilà. Vous pouvez laisser les commentaires et tout, là. Je vais dire. At dawn on 11 May, the German engineers began working their way up the slopes. The operation was difficult and the Belgian guns made it hazardous. But for one vital item, the attackers would have been swept from the plateau as rapidly as they reached it. That was the bombardment of the morning before, which, while not damaging the works, had left the fields a mass of shell holes. Into these shelter the attackers dived. Now began the climactic phase of the entire operation, the assault. The immediate objective was to get the engineers up to certain selected works. To protect their advance, flat-firing anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns delivered point-blank fire against the embrasure, trying to put out Ibn Emmanuel's eyes. The chemical warfare troops blinded adjacent supporting works with smoke. The infantry covered the embrasure with small arms fire and stood ready to consolidate any success the engineers might gain. There is no minimizing the hazards involved. The losses amongst the engineers, as they bounded and crawled from one hole to the next, were heavy. These men resembled walking arsenals. Hand grenades were sticking out of the tops of the boots and from between the buttons of blouses. Round almost every neck was slung a canvas sack bulging with 7-pound blocks of TNT. Each soldier carried a rifle or a submachine gun. Many pushed or pulled 15-foot length of narrow board to which were tied end-to-end other blocks of TNT. Others carried 20-foot charge placing poles, which looked like elongated bricklayers' hoods. Still others logged flamethrowers. It was a strange and grotesque assembly, but one in which every last detail was the result of innumerable trials. The boards loaded with TNT were used, as in the First World War, to blast a way through the barbed wires. Each one blew a path perhaps 20 feet wide, and also destroyed nearby mines. Guns on both sides were fired as fast as men could load them. Occasionally there was a crash louder than normal, indicating that one of the engineers and his bag full of TNT had gone up, but the advance continued, and finally the surviving engineers reached the works. Here they were comparatively safe, for fortification can deliver deadly fire on areas far to the front, sides and rear. But there is a small area immediately adjacent to it, which the guns cannot be depressed to reach. Now began the action to which all that had gone before was simple preparation. The flamethrowers opened up against the embrasures. The engineers fused up their block of TNT and from their points of vantage began systematically to demolish the works by detonating the TNT against sensitive parts. Embrasures, ports, turrets, joints and doors. Where possible, they placed the charge by hand, set off a delay fuse and took cover round a corner or in a shell hole. In other cases, the charge were given a shorter delay fuse and tossed into embrasures like hand grenades, or they were put in the hot end of a charge placing pole and pushed into place. The action which now took place defies description. The flamethrowers belched flame. The German anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns continued to fire. The Belgian gun answered, smoke and flame and crashing detonation. It is doubtful if the history of warfare had ever seen the like. The TNT began to make itself felt. Here an embrasure went out of action. There a turret was jammed. As the Belgian army to fire decreased, the German engineers multiplied their effectiveness. The Belgian sands were running out. The action was too violent, the effect too decisive, to continue for long. After several works had been put out of action, the Belgian commander saw the hopelessness of the situation. His great fortress, able to command the approaches to a country, had fallen prey to a band of men armed not with howitzer and cannon, but with 7-pound blocks of TNT. Early in the afternoon of 11 May, the fortress surrendered. It was not a new secret weapon, but the revolutionary use of an old one that did it. The Last Enemy, a condensation of the book by Richard Hillary. Richard Hillary, the devil-may-care young Oxford undergraduate who exchanged his place in an Oxford rowing crew for the cockpit of a Spitfire, personified the Battle of Britain hero. His book, The Last Enemy, written while he was convalescing from a long series of operations after he had been shot down, is a personal testimony which gives a vivid, compelling picture of the impact of war on the individual. Hillary was killed on active service in 1943. His book lives on as one of the classics of the war. The English Channel, 1940, The Last Enemy. I had been at Oxford for 2 years, rowing a great deal, flying a little and reading somewhat, and was not yet 21 when the war broke out. While it would be false to suggest that the university was blissfully unaware of the impending disaster, it was certainly true that outside events had little effect on our easygoing way of life. I had spent every vacation visiting the continent. On one of these trips, shortly before the war, I went to Germany. A friend of mine felt the same urge, and we worked out the cheapest way to go. About this time, I had been stroking one of the boat crews, though I was a week-end pilot. In the University Air Squadron, rowing was the only accomplishment in which I could get credit for being slightly better than average. We wrote to the German government expressing a wish to row in one of their regattas. They replied that they would be delighted and offered to pay our expense. We wrote back with appropriate gratification, and having collected 8 others, on 3rd July 1938 we set forth. We were to row against one of General Goering's prize forts. We arrived at Bad Ems 2 days before the race, without a boat, and had to use a borrowed craft. The elegantly turned out German crews, who came with carloads and supporters and set, determined faces, regarded us with contemptuous amusement. Shortly before the race, a member of a German crew harangued me about our lackadaisical attitude and our decadent race. The German people would learn, he said, from our defeat. I suggest that he might wait until after the race before shooting off his mouth, but he was not listening. Looking back, this race was a surprisingly accurate pointer to the course of the war. We were out of training, lacked any form of organization, and were quite hopelessly casual. We got off to such a clumsy start that we were several lengths behind at the beginning of the race. As we came to the bridge, which was the halfway mark, We must have been 5 lengths behind, but somebody spat on us. It was a tactical error. We covered the rest of the course as though pursued by fiends, and won the race. To the sullen resentment of our adversaries, General Goering had to surrender his cup. It disgraced our rooms for nearly a year until we sent it back. The Oxford generation, which went to war in 1939, was self-satisfied, disillusioned, and spoilt. We had no holy grail in search of which we could lose ourselves. The war, provided it gave us the opportunity to prove that our effete veneer was not as deep as our dislike of interference, and to demonstrate that, though undisciplined, we were a match for Hitler's formulas, for Hitler's dogma-fed youth. September 3rd, 1939 fell during the long vacation, and our University Air Squadron reported that day to the Volunteer Reserve Center at Oxford. The war solved the problem of my career. As a fighter pilot, I hoped for a concentration of amusement, fear, and exaltation, which it would be impossible to experience in any other way. I was not disappointed. We were drafted to an initial training wing, where I found myself in command of a platoon. My fellow sergeants were farmers, bank clerks, estate agents, representatives of every class and calling. I was commissioned on the score of my experience in the University Air Squadron, and I moved to another wing. Here I found myself among many old Oxford friends. This was the pre-Dunkirk phony war period, and we were inclined to regard regulation as a nuisance. We never saw an aircraft and never attended a lecture. We took an hotel room and idled away 6 weeks, drinking and playing cards. That our behavior was uncooperative did not occur to us. We had joined the Air Force to fly and not to parade about like Boy Scouts. We didn't consider then that elementary training might be essential, or that a certain confusion was inevitable at the beginning of the war. But when we were sent to a flying training school on the northeast coast of Scotland, we buckled down to a routine life of flying and lectures. Thanks to a patient instructor, I gradually developed from a mediocre performer to a quite moderate pilot. For weeks my instructor, a likable Scot with a dour sense of humor, sat in the cockpit behind me muttering, just loud enough for me to hear, about the bad luck of getting such a fat head for a pupil. Then one day he called down, "Man, you can fly at last." The pilot on our course ranged from schoolboys of 18 to men of 26. Raw material, out of which had to be welded officers for fighter, bomber, and coastal commands. There as the month went by, one could watch the gradual assimilation of these men, so diverse in their lives and habits, into the composite figure that is the Air Force pilot. From time to time a squadron of long-range bombers would come dropping out of the sky. For a week or so they would make our station their headquarters for raids on Norway. One day 9 set out and only 4 returned. I watched closely the pilots in the mess that night, but their faces were expressionless. They played bridge as usual and discussed the next day's raid. Then one day a Spitfire squadron dropped in. It was my first glimpse of the machines I hoped eventually to fly. The trim, deceptive frailty of their lines was fascinating. I spent much of my spare time climbing onto their wings and inspecting the controls. At the end of the course, I was posted to Army Cooperation, which entailed further training at Old Sarum before we could graduate to Lysander reconnaissance plane, which were gloomily termed flying coffins. Old Sarum was close to Salisbury, and the towering steeple of the cathedral was a good landmark for the airfield. A few minutes flying to the south was the sea, and across that was France, peaceful in the quiet of the evening. Within a few weeks Britain's army was to be struggling desperately to get back across that narrow stretch of water, and the France we knew was to be no more. In the midst of our training, the war news grew bad. Every night the mess was crowded with Air Force officers parked round the radio with silent, expressionless faces, listening to the extermination of France and the desperate retreat to Dunkirk. Privately we learnt that Lyssanders were hopping across the Channel 2 or 3 times daily to drop supplies to the besieged garrison at Calais, sometimes with a solitary one-gun fighter for support. As the Lysander was supposed always to operate under a covering layer of fire, we could imagine how desperate the situation must be. Then came Dunkirk. Tired, raged men who had once been an army, returning now without their equipment, after days on the beaches without a sight of British planes. These men were bitter, and not unnaturally. They could not know that had the RAF not gained air superiority behind them over Flanders, they would never have left Dunkirk alive. For us the evacuation was a newspaper story, until 3 of us got the day off, drove to Brighton and saw for ourselves. The beaches, streets and pubs were a crawling mass of soldiers, British, French and Belgian. They had no money, but were being royally welcomed by the locals. They were very tired and very patient. It had been so long. What could a few more hours matter? The most frequent request was for somewhere to bathe their feet. We collected 2 French soldiers and a Belgian dispatch rider, and took them off for a drink. The pub we chose was full of soldiers, and we were soon involved in half-dozen arguments over the whereabouts of our aircraft over Dunkirk. Knowing personally several pilots who had been killed, and with some knowledge of the true fact, we found it hard to keep our tempers. The French soldiers were less bitter. While they had seen few British aircraft, they had seen no French at all. But our Belgian endorsed everything we said. How could we expect to see many British planes? He asked. There was a heavy fog over the beaches and they were up above. Our fight, however, he had seen. A lone Spitfire among 4 Junkers. For him, he said, it had been symbolic. If that Spitfire came out on top, they would be rescued. He prayed and his prayer was answered. It shot down 2 Germans, crippled the 3rd, and the 4th made off. We talked and drank well into the night. The returned soldiers were tired and relaxed, content to sit back, their troubles for the moment over. We were taut and expectant, braced by our first real contact with the war. Finally, through an alcoholic haze, we made our farewells and set off for Old Sarum. We were late and drove fast. There was no moon. Coming out of a bend, our car skid hung for a moment on 2 wheels. When turned over twice, after extricating ourselves, we found that we hadn't even a scratch. It looks, said one of my companions, as though fate doesn't want us to go out this way. A few weeks later, all leave was cancelled. No one was allowed far from the airfield and the invasion scare was on. The government's appeal to the people to stay put and not to evacuate roused Britain to the imminence of disaster. It could actually happen. Britain's green and pleasant land might at any moment wake to the noise of thundering tanks, to the sight of an army dropping from the sky, and to the realization that it was too late. The civilian population woke up. It was their war. From the age of 17 to 70, they came forward for the Home Guard. If they had no arms, and usually they hadn't, they drilled with brooms, the spirit was there. Owing to the sudden collapse of France and the consequent vulnerability of Britain, The Air Ministry had ordered 15 of us to be transferred to fighter squadrons. Each looked at his neighbor as though he were suddenly an enemy. There were 20 of us. The 5 who would stay behind were to be drawn from a hat. It was my worst moment of the war, and I speak for all the others. After the drawing, I was lucky. We left for Gloucestershire for a fortnight training. There we learned of the German habit of stepping up their fighter escorts in layers all round their bombers, their excellence in carrying out a prearranged maneuver, and their confusion once their plan was disturbed. We learned of the advantage of height, and of attacking from out of the sun, of the Germans' disinclination to fight on unfavorable terms, of the Messerschmitt's almost standardized method of evasion, a half-roll followed by a vertical dive. We learned of the necessity to work as a squadron, and to understand thoroughly every command of the squadron leader, whether given by radio or gesture. We learned to appreciate the contribution of our ground crews to successful days fighting. We learned that we should never follow a plane down after hitting it. This point was driven home by the example of 5 planes, all of which followed each other down. Only the top machine survived. And we learned finally to fly the Spitfire. Though I suffered some trepidation before my first flight, I soon got the feel of the new machine, enough to try it out in aerobatics. I put it through every maneuver I knew, and it responded beautifully. After that, I felt an exhilarating confidence. I could fly a Spitfire. It remained to be seen whether I could fight in one. We also had to put in an oxygen climb to 28,000 feet, an air firing exercise, formation attacks, and numerous dogfights. The oxygen climb was uneventful, but lengthy. Emmett's goggles and oxygen mask gave me a feeling of restriction, and from then on I flew with goggles up. The results were to be far-reaching. During the air firing exercise, all eight guns roared out from a quick pressure on the fire button on the control stick. The noise through the closed-in cabin was muffled, but the tremendous recoil caused a drop in speed of 40 miles per hour. When we were sent up for a practice dogfight, 2 of us would go off and try to shoot each other down. On one occasion, I went up with an instructor named Kilpatrick. We climbed to 10,000 feet, and he indicated that he would get on my tail. He succeeded. In frenzied eagerness, I hurled my machine about the sky. Never, I felt, had such thing been done to a plane. They must inevitably dislodge him. But my mirror showed that he was behind me like a patient nursemaid following a too boisterous charge. Then he signaled to me to get on his tail and stay there. I carried out the first part of my order and started to pursue him in every tightening circle. I attempted to get him in my sights, but could never quite succeed. I kept expecting to catch him, but these circles were making me dizzy. Then I glanced in the mirror. He had turned the tables and was now following me, his guns in position to shoot me down. I was dead, quote unquote, long ago. On landing, Kilpatrick told me of the slight use of aerobatics in battle. A loop or a slow roll presented a target your opponent could easily keep in his sights. The best maneuvers for evasion were a half roll and a controlled spin, especially if you had been hit, for it gave an impression of being out of control. For the rest, it was a question of turning inside your opponent, thinking quickly and clearly and breaking away quickly. Our training ended. It was announced that 603 City of Edinburgh Squadron had 3 vacancies. 3 of us who had been together at Oxford, Peter Peace, Colin Pinkney, and I, put our names down and were sent to join Flight B, which was operating near Montrose in Scotland. For the most part, life at Montrose was very agreeable. The airfield lay just beyond the town, parallel to the sea, one edge to the landing field merging into the dunes. The squadron was comparatively inactive, though we knew that at a not very distant date the war would be upon us. One day Peter Peace and I were sent by train to Edinburgh to fly up a couple of new Spitfires. Peter had never had much to say about the war, and on the train I felt an urge to get behind his natural polite reserve. So I asked him straight out his reasons for fighting. He evaded the question at first, but I pressed him, and he looked at me with that slow smile of his. I would say that I was fighting the war to rid the world of fear. Of the fear of fear is perhaps what I mean. If the Germans win this war, nobody except little Hitlers will dare do anything. All courage will die out of the world. The courage to love, to create, to take risks, whether physical or intellectual or moral. Thus, all spontaneity will die out of the world. The oxygen breathed by the soul, so to speak, will vanish and mankind will wither. That's all negative, I said. Isn't there something positive you want? Of course there is. What I want is to see a better world. What do you mean by better? I challenged him. Christian? Yes, Christian, of course. It isn't only that I am Christian by faith. I don't know of any other way of life worth fighting for. Christianity means to me, on the social plane, freedom, man's humanity to man. I believe that we should all make our contribution to the betterment of humanity. You don't agree? I can see that. You're quite right, I said. I don't. I think your Christianity clouds the issue. To be brutal about it, I say I am fighting this war because I believe that in war one can swiftly develop all one's faculties to a degree it would normally take half a lifetime to achieve. That's why I am in the Air Force. For in a Spitfire, we're back to war as it ought to be. Back to individual battle, to total responsibility for one's own fate, to self-reliance. One either kills or is killed, and it's damned exciting. The mass of mankind leaves me completely cold. You're a fraud, Richard, Peter said cheerfully, and I am sure you will change your tune. Something bigger than you or me is coming out of this, something that will make you forget yourself. I doubt it, I said, and at that we left it. When we got back to Montrose, we were greeted with exciting news. We're on our way. The whole squadron was moving south to Hornchurch, an aerodrome 12 miles east of London on the Thames estuary. For us the war had begun. Our relief squadron was already coming in, and in a few minutes we roared across the aerodrome and headed south. 24 of us flew south that 10th day of August 1940. Of those 24, 8 were to fly back. At Hornchurch, planes were already in action. One flight started coming in about half an hour after we landed. Smoke stains along the leading edges of the wings, showing that all the guns had been fired. You don't have to look for Jerry's, we were told. You have to look for a way out. At this time, the Germans were making a determined attempt to wipe out our fighter force. From dawn till dusk, the sky was filled with Messerschmitt fighters. There were comparatively few bombers. The first attack usually came over about breakfast time, and from then until 8 o'clock at night, we were almost continuously in the air. We ate when we could. On the morning after our arrival, the voice of the controller came unhurried over the loudspeaker, telling us to take off. I climbed into the cockpit and felt an empty sensation in the pit of my stomach. That morning I knew I was to kill for the first time. That I might be killed or injured did not occur to me. I wondered idly what he was like, this man I would kill. Was he young? Was he fat? Would he die with the Führer's name on his lips? Or would he die alone, in that last moment conscious only of himself as a man? I would never know. Then I was being strapped in, my mind automatically checking the control, and we were off. We ran into them at 18,000 feet, 20 yellow-nosed Messerschmitts about 500 feet above us. Our squadron's strength was 8. And as they came down, we went into line astern and turned head-on to them. I could almost feel the leading Nazi pilot push forward on his stick to bring his gun to bear on our leading machine. At the same moment, our section leader quickly nosed up and led us over them in a steep climbing turn. In 2 vital seconds, they lost their advantage. I saw our leader let go a burst of fire at the leading plane, saw the Nazi put his machine into a half-roll, and knew that he was mine. I kicked the rudder to the left and get him at right angles, turned the gun button to fire, and let go in a 4-second burst. He came right through my sight, and I saw the tracers from all 8 guns stud home. For a second he seemed to hang motionless. Then a jet of red flame shot upward and he spun to the ground. For the next few minutes I was too busy to think of anything, but when after a short while they made off over the channel, my mind began to work again. It had happened. My first emotion was one of satisfaction at a job adequately done, at the final logical conclusion to months of specialized training, and then I had a feeling of the essential rightness of it. He was dead and I was alive. I could so easily have been the other way around. I realized in that moment just how lucky among soldiers a fighter pilot is. His emotions are those of the duelist, cool, precise, impersonal. He is privileged to kill well. After the first 2 days, we determined not to let ourselves be caught from above. We would fly on the reciprocal of the course given us by the controller until we got 15,000 feet and then fly back again. Allô? Ça va? Ça me dérange pas. J'étais en train de stream.
C'est vrai?
Ouais. Oh.
Quoi?
YouTube ne reçoit pas suffisamment de données vidéo pour assurer une diffusion fluide. Par conséquent, une mise en mémoire tampon sera nécessaire. Oh.